Hi everyone, today I'm going to be showing you how to dissect a dogfish. Right here on the table I do have a specimen. I am going to go through just the basic orientation of the animal, and then I'm going to zoom in and show you each of the pieces kind of one by one. It is a fairly large animal, so it's a little more difficult to get the entire creature in frame while still being able to see adequate detail. So where I have my fingers right now, this is obviously the head of the animal, and we can also refer to this as the cranial end. Opposite to that, here, would be the caudal end. And the surface of the animal that's showing upwards right now is the dorsal. We can turn it over, and this we would see the ventral side. While we have the animal on the ventral side, let's point out a couple of the fins. So here we have the pectoral fins. And then back here, we have the pelvic fins. We'll get a closer look at the pelvic fins when I go to start the dissection, but these ones are specifically structured so that we have the pelvic fin and the clasper. So this is a male dogfish. We can see that the tail is broken, and that's just something that tends to happen when they package up these larger animals. I also want to note that the animal's vent is going to be right between the two pelvic fins. So a fin type that's actually missing from the dogfish is the anal fin. So some sharks have an anal fin, dogfish do not. If we go back to the dorsal side facing, we can still see our pectoral fins. And then we also have a dorsal fin, so that's our first dorsal fin, and a second dorsal fin back here. These are spiny dogfish, and normally they would actually have quite a large spine projecting off of each of their dorsal fins. Those are a little bit hazardous actually, so those have actually been removed from these dissection specimens. Now that we have the broad overview, let's zoom in and look a little closer at some of the zones. All right, if we start at the frontmost portion here, this is the rostrum. Sometimes we refer to it as a snout, but the proper term for this is the rostrum. We can also see the eyes here. If we look just behind the eye here, we can see the animal's spiracle. You can see it on that side there. And the spiracle is kind of an opening to allow for water to flow over the gills. So water will enter via the spiracle and also via the animal's open mouth. On this view here, we can see a lot, I'm not sure if you'll be able to see that on the video, that there's a lot of little pores along the front of the rostrum, and also a pair right here. So this pair of pores here, these are the ampulla of Lorenzini. So those have to do with perceiving electrochemical signals in the water. If we turn the animal to the ventral side here, we can find the nares. So that's these ones here. And then of course we can see the mouth as well. What you may not be able to see, but you'll definitely be able to see when we do the dissection in person, is that there are many rows of teeth. So as soon as one tooth is lost, there are more rows of them ready to take its place. Here we can also see the shark's gill slits. So that's going to be where the water will pass out of the animal once it's passed over the gills. We will take a look at the gill structure in just a moment. I will now change our view a little bit and start doing our actual dissection. So now we're ready to look at the internal anatomy of our dogfish. So for this, we're going to be making a cut. We're going to start down here near the pelvic fins. We're going to cut all along the side here. It's often easier to remove one of the pectoral fins, but I'm going to try to keep those in place for today. And then we can also take a look up closer to the gill slits. So this is just going to take me a little moment of cutting. Before I do also want to point out, here's just our closer view of the claspers. So you can see that these pelvic fins are modified in such a way so that they have these kind of firm projections coming off of those, and that will actually be used to aid in internal fertilization. So here we go, we'll start cutting. It is important to note that the skin of the dogfish, these scales have almost a sandpaper-like consistency. So they can be a little bit difficult to cut through, and they can also dull your scalpel blade rather quickly. So it's important to keep an eye out on that and make sure that you're just performing your dissection safely. So once we've got that initial cut made, we can carry that forward. Again, I'm just checking every so often to make sure that I'm not puncturing the internal organs. And almost right to the top of the body cavity. Apologies there. So I'm almost at the top of the body cavity, so I'm just cutting across. And opening out that piece of flesh. So at this point, you may find it helpful to have dissecting pins so that you can dissect so that you can pin your fins out of the way. Probably the first thing that you noticed when I opened this is this pooling of liquid here. So this is a little bit of preserving fluid and also some of the natural oils that are coming from the shark's liver. I'm just going to go ahead and get rid of those. You can do this in many different ways. One way that I find really efficient is to just take your specimen over to the sink and give it a quick rinse. Another thing that can work quite well is to just insert paper towels and absorb it out of there. Okay, now that we've got the shark open, I'm just going to change its orientation and start walking you through the internal anatomy. At this point, we've opened up our thoracic cavity, but we also want to have a look at the animal's gills and heart. So to do that, we're just going to continue to make a cut, and we're essentially cutting right through the gills. And to do this, we'll have to cut through the pectoral girdle a little bit. there we go. We can remove that piece out of the way. And now that I've done that, you can see the gill filaments. So here, if I push that down, maybe you can see it a little bit better. But just like in the bony fish, we actually do have a gill structure where we have the raker's arch and filament. If we look at this piece in my hand, this region here I've actually cut off the filament, but here we have the gill arch and here we have the gill rakers. Now, in addition to being able to see the gill filaments, we can also see the shark's heart. Right now there's a little bit of excess tissue that's just kind of a byproduct from the preservation. So I'm just going to move that out of our way, and then we'll walk through the actual anatomy of the heart. So when I removed that piece that was covering this, I actually removed the pericardium, which is a thin membrane that covers the heart. If we take a look at the shark's heart, we start off here with the conus arteriosus. This large, most obvious part of the heart that we see here, that is the ventricle. It's going to be a little bit more firm and muscular. We can see a little peek of the atrium off to the side here, and also a little bit peeking out there. And then this is a hard one for me to show you on video, but we have a great photo of it. If I lift the heart up here, I'll lift the heart up with a pair of scissors, and we can see I actually cut into it a little bit, but we have what's known as the sinus venosus. So I can see I've cut it on the one edge here. So these are the kind of 4 parts of the shark's heart. Now we'll shift a little bit and start looking at what's in the thoracic cavity. So the large it's usually grayish in color. This is going to be the shark's liver, and you can actually move some of it aside. You're going to have to move some of it aside so that you can see the other parts. So this is one of the lobes. We have a second large lobe here that I'm just moving aside. And then we have a third lobe that's really quite small. We've got it up here. And at the very tip, this one's third lobe is a little bit, it's structured a little bit differently than I'm used to seeing. It's actually separated out a little bit. Normally this is one kind of more obvious triangle. At the tip of that triangle, and kind of along the one side, there is a flattened pouch that we can see running along right here. And that is the gallbladder. So that's going to be the spot where bile is stored. If we lift the liver towards the head a little bit, we can see a little bit of the esophagus. And the esophagus continues down here to the stomach. Now this shark has a particularly large stomach. It would have just had a meal fairly recently before being sacrificed. So it's not usually this large. Usually it's more smooth and just shaped like a kind of a J. At the posterior, towards the posterior end of the stomach, we kind of make a little turn here. Right before we make the turn, we're going to find another structure that Looks fairly similar in color and texture to the liver. That will be our shark's spleen. And then as we continue along to the J, the tip of the J here, we'll find another piece here. Sometimes it helps if I just get my finger in behind there. So we have this piece here. That is the pancreas. We can also really clearly see this kind of narrowing. This is going to be our pyloric sphincter, and that's going to be our transition point between the stomach and the duodenum. The duodenum then continues to what's known as the spiral intestine. So we have that there. And then eventually the spiral intestine smooths out, and we have, it will exit via the rectum. If we move it off to the side, we'll be able to see this finger-like projection here. That is the animal's rectal gland, and that's going to be used for osmoregulation, so controlling the salt balance. Now, I mentioned that this is known as a spiral intestine, and I'm going to show you why that is by just cutting into it. You can see the internal structure of the intestine. It literally goes in the pattern of a spiral. So our intestines are quite long to give more surface area for absorption of nutrients, and a bit of a modification here for the dogfish is they've got that extra surface area, but it's in the form of these kind of spiraling tunnels within the spiral intestine. If we move our stomach off to the side, we end up with some veins in the way, veins and arteries. So these are, well, this one here is joining up with the liver, so that's going to be a hepatic vein. I'm just going to cut those so that they're out of our way, because what I'm really wanting to show you up here is the testes. So they are long ovals that are up quite far anteriorly, and they are paired. We can see the bottom of the other one on this side here. It may be a little difficult to tell the orientation of the shark right now, just because of how I've cut it. But this line running down here is kind of our center line of the animal. And on either side of that center line, we will have the kidneys running basically the entire length of the body cavity. And you'll be able to, when you see this up close, I'm not sure if you can see it on the video, it might be rather difficult, but overlying the kidney, there's actually almost like a small kind of wiggling tubes, and those are going to be the seminal vesicles. So they actually lie over top of the kidney. This is our basic male shark anatomy. We can come back in just a moment and we'll see how the female shark looks a little bit different. Now here we have our female dogfish. Her external anatomy is going to be the same as the male's. The only exception to that is going to be with her pelvic fins. So here she's actually positioned in a nice way that we can easily see those pectoral fins. We've got our first dorsal fin here, second dorsal fin back here, her caudal fin. It's just a little bit folded because of how it was packaged. But then if we turn her over, she has a different anatomy going on with her pelvic fins. There. If we pulled the pelvic fins out, we can see that they're a lot broader, a little bit more square in structure, and they don't have that big, large clasper poking out of it. Now, in terms of the actual dissection, this is going to look very much the same as how I did the male. But once I get in here, the anatomy should be really quite interesting for us. And we'll just pin this open. And we can take a look at her internal anatomy. So you can see that her thoracic cavity is really quite packed full, and there's a good reason for that. Just like with the male, we've got a very large liver. So there's one lobe, second lobe here, that one we'll just leave it in place, and this is our third lobe, and on the edge of the front lobe, or sorry, on the edge of that third lobe is where we can see the gallbladder. There, we should be able to see the gallbladder along there. Now if we look a little closer, again, her anatomy looks a little bit different. For her, she actually ate something a little bit more recently than the male did, because she has a really distended esophagus here. So this big thick portion there is the esophagus. Again, not normally that thick, but since she has eaten fairly recently, we can see that there. So that's her esophagus going into the stomach. So the stomach's actually fairly empty in this shark. Most of what we're seeing is in the esophagus. We then go into our kind of a J shape on the stomach. At the bottom of the J is where we find our spleen. And then as we go back up, here we've got our pancreas. That's nice and visible. And let's see if, there we've actually got our pyloric sphincter as well. So that's that little narrowing between the stomach and the duodenum. From the duodenum, we make our way into the spiral intestine. And then it's probably going to be a little difficult to find just because there's a whole lot going on down here. But we will also be able to find that rectal gland. There we go. See, I think it's a little bit too underneath for you to see. Oh, there we go. There's our rectal gland, that gland for salt regulation. Now, the reason that we have such a full cavity is that I ordered a pregnant female. So if let's take a look at her one side here. If we take a look at the one side here, we can we'll move the liver out of the way, we'll move the great big esophagus out of the way, and we will be able to find her ovary. So it's a little bit of a weird shape right now because of how packaged up it was. So how tight things were within the vacuum packaging. I'm going to try to zoom here and see if you can actually see there is a little bit of a egg shape going on there. So right between my two fingers there, you can actually see the definition of eggs that are developing in that ovary. From the ovary, the egg would be released via the ostium, which we're not really seeing right now just because of the angles, and it would make its way into the oviduct. So the oviduct, the human equivalent to this would be the fallopian tube, but we generally say fallopian tube for when we're talking about mammals, so let's call it an oviduct. And that will make its way all the way to the uterus. We'll open one side of the uterus so that you can see the developing young. So right in here we have some young shark embryos, and I'm just going to bring them out so that we can look at them on their own. So I'll start from the top here. So you can see that each of these have a yolk sac, and then they've got the developing embryo that's attached to that yolk sac. So here we have our developing dogfish embryo. You can see a lot of its external features are already quite fully developed. We can actually even see a spiracle right there. And these little developing embryos are then attached to the yolk sac. So dogfish undergo a reproductive technique that's known as ovoviviparous. So what that means is that if they were oviparous, that would mean that they would lay eggs. As an animal that's ovoviviparous, they release their eggs from their ovaries. They will have internal fertilization, and those embryos will develop inside the mother. However, the embryo is getting all of its nutrition from this yolk sac and not directly from the mother. There's no placenta and there's no nutrient exchange between the developing embryos and the adult female. There's also the situation that we have with mammals, which is called viviparous. So that's when the embryo will develop inside the mother. It will receive nutrition from the mother, usually via placenta. And then when the young are born, they will be relatively well developed and they will have gotten nutrition from the mother. Since this shark has a stomach that's rather distended, I'm going to take a quick look at what is inside. So I don't want to completely destroy the stomach, but I am a little bit curious. So I'll open that up just enough. Wow, he has inside his stomach, he has what looks to be the head of another fish. Yep, I can definitely still see the gills of that guy. But that's about all that I can make out of that one.